Elon Musk risks his life to stop a runaway train. Shocking outcome ensues. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rugged terrain. The train track, snaking through the mountains, was barely visible from the hilltop. In the distance, a loud, rumbling sound began to grow louder, an ominous warning of what was to come. Elon Musk, dressed in a suit but looking out of place in the wilderness, stood at the edge of the hill, gazing at the massive train speeding towards him. The whistle echoed in the air, the sound of an unstoppable force. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. There was no time for second thoughts, no time to doubt his decision. The lives of the people on that train, and perhaps many others down the line, were at risk. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his wristwatch, the seconds ticking by with cruel precision. He had been tracking the runaway train for hours now, receiving updates on the radio from his team. The situation was dire. The brakes had failed. The train, carrying hundreds of passengers, was speeding out of control, heading directly towards a steep curve ahead, one that was notoriously dangerous at high speeds. If they couldn't stop it, the crash would be catastrophic. "I can't let that happen," Elon muttered under his breath, clenching his fists. He had no real plan. There wasn't time to develop one. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't just stand by and let it happen. Behind him, his team of engineers, technicians, and experts were in constant communication, but none of their ideas had worked so far. The train was too far gone, its momentum building faster than anything they could manage remotely. The plan had initially been to track the train's position using satellite imagery, hoping to find a way to safely slow it down or divert it. But now, there was no time for waiting. No time for anything but action. Elon turned away from the team and looked out across the train tracks once more. He had a split-second decision to make. The only way to stop this train in time was to somehow reach the control station situated on the tracks just ahead. But the only way to get there? The tracks themselves. Without hesitation, Elon took a deep breath, adjusted his suit jacket, and began running toward the tracks. The train was getting closer, its speed increasing with each passing second. Musk's heart raced as adrenaline surged through his veins. This wasn't just about stopping a train, this was about saving lives. If he could get to the control station, maybe, just maybe, he could override the train's systems and prevent the inevitable disaster. As he approached the tracks, his thoughts flashed back to the early days of SpaceX, to those moments when failure seemed inevitable. He had always believed that if you didn't fail, you weren't trying hard enough. But today, failure wasn't an option. Today, success was a matter of life and death. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the train's horn grew louder. Elon's pace quickened, but the distance seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step felt like it might be his last, but he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. In the distance, the control station came into view. The lights flickered in the early evening light, as if calling to him, beckoning him to make it in time. Just as the train neared the turn ahead, Elon reached the control station, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His fingers fumbled for the door handle, but the latch was stuck. Panic surged through him, but he quickly regained his composure, pulling with all his strength. The door finally gave way. Inside, the control panel was illuminated, buttons flashing red, warning lights blinking in every direction. The train system was malfunctioning, its controls locked in an automatic override. The engineers' voices crackled through his earpiece, urging him to hurry. "Elon, you have to shut down the engine manually. The system has overridden the automatic failsafe." He didn't waste time responding. He understood. With swift movements, Elon began pressing buttons, pulling levers, and connecting cables. The train was only a few moments from the bend. If he didn't act now, it would be too late. The control station seemed to hum with life as the systems flickered to life under his touch. Sweat poured down his face, and his palms were clammy, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The voices on the comms grew louder, urging him on. "You're almost there, Elon. Just a few more seconds." The train, now less than a minute away from the curve, screeched as it continued to barrel forward, its brakes useless. Elon glanced back toward the tracks through the control room window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, with a sharp, triumphant push, the system came alive. The emergency brakes began to engage, but it was a race against time. The train's horn blasted one final time as the massive machine slowly began to decelerate. It wasn't enough to completely stop it in time, but it was enough to prevent the crash. A few feet from the turn, the train came to a grinding halt. Elon staggered back from the console, his breath ragged, his face drained from the effort. The sound of the train grinding to a halt echoed in his ears. He had done it. He had saved hundreds of lives. Through the comms, his team erupted in cheers, but Elon barely registered it. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the rush of emotions. Relief, fear, and exhaustion all hit him at once. "Elon, you did it. You saved them," one of the engineers said. But all Elon could do was slump against the wall, his eyes closing for a moment. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. It was a dangerous gamble, a last-ditch effort that could have ended in failure. But it hadn't. And that, Elon mused to himself as he stood there in the control room, was all that mattered. He had risked everything, and in the end, it had paid off. As the train came to a stop, the passengers began to stir, their faces filled with confusion and shock. They didn't know how close they had come to disaster. They didn't know that a man with no real plan had saved them, just in time. The train conductor's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have stopped the train safely. Please stay seated until we can assess the situation." Elon exhaled slowly, his body finally relaxing after the high-stakes moment. He had saved the day, but it had been too close for comfort. A voice interrupted his thoughts, a voice he recognized. "Elon, you okay?" It was his close colleague, speaking through his earpiece. "I'm fine," Elon said, his voice steady. "I'm just glad I made it in time." "You saved them, Elon," the voice replied, pride in its tone. "You saved everyone." The train was halted, the threat averted. The world would continue to turn. But for Elon Musk, this would be a moment he'd never forget. Elon stood there, taking in a deep breath as the sounds of relief from his team echoed in his ear. The train, now at a complete stop, stood still like a giant beast that had just been tamed. For a moment, all he could do was listen to the faint hum of the control systems, still whirring in the background. He walked over to the large window in the control room, his eyes focused on the now stationary train just beyond the tracks. It felt surreal. Only minutes ago, that train had been barreling towards certain disaster, and now it was completely still, its passengers unaware of the near-death experience they had just survived. Despite the overwhelming sense of relief, Elon couldn't shake off the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. The quiet after the storm felt deafening, and for a second, it was like the world around him had paused as well. Everything had hinged on that one decision. He could feel his pulse begin to slow, his breathing steadying. "Elon," his colleague's voice interrupted his thoughts. "We need to secure the area. There might still be a few other concerns we need to address before everyone disembarks." Elon nodded slowly, the reality of the situation setting in. While the train had been stopped, there was still work to do. The damage, the repairs, and the aftermath of this event all needed to be handled before anyone could truly relax. He turned back to the console, where the flashing lights had settled into a more manageable pattern. "I'll be right there," Elon said, his voice calm now that the immediate danger had passed. As he moved toward the door, he glanced out the window one last time at the train. The passengers would be all right, he had ensured that. But there was a part of him that knew that they would never truly know how close they had come to disaster. How one man, in a moment of desperation, had defied the odds to stop something no one else could. A slight sense of pride welled up inside him, though he immediately tamped it down. He wasn't one to boast. Not when so much could have gone wrong. The door to the control room slid open, and Elon stepped out into the narrow corridor. The engineers were busy with their own tasks, each man and woman assessing the situation, making sure everything was under control. The air was still thick with the tension of the past few minutes, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that didn't quite feel like victory. As he walked toward the main exit, he spotted one of the lead engineers, Tom, speaking with a few of the passengers who had already started to disembark. There was a sense of calm among them, and it seemed like no one fully understood the gravity of what had just occurred. "Hey, Elon," Tom called, waving him over. "We've got the situation under control here." The passengers are mostly calm, though they're a bit confused about what happened. "The train will be able to continue after we assess the tracks." Elon nodded and stepped closer, taking in the calm demeanor of Tom's voice. It was a good sign, but Elon couldn't ignore the fact that they had all just survived something that could have been catastrophic. "I'm glad to hear that. Keep me updated," Elon replied, still scanning the area for any signs of trouble. As he stood there, something caught his attention. He looked down the platform where a few of the passengers had gathered, their faces full of curiosity and confusion. Among them was a young woman, standing a little farther off than the others, her hands clutching the straps of a large bag slung over her shoulder. Something about her stood out. She wasn't panicked like the others. Instead, there was a sense of calm and observation in her posture, as if she had witnessed something far worse before. "Everything okay?" Elon called out, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the passengers. The woman looked up, meeting his gaze with a surprising intensity. She was younger than most of the others, perhaps in her early 20s, with a look of quiet resilience. She stepped closer, her eyes still locked on him as she approached. "Thank you for saving us," she said simply, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm sure you don't need to hear it, but I mean it." "Thank you." Elon felt a lump form in his throat at the sincerity of her words. He hadn't expected that kind of acknowledgement. He had acted on instinct, not thinking about the applause or recognition, just the lives at stake. "Of course," he said with a small, appreciative smile. "We just did what needed to be done." The woman nodded, and for a moment, there was silence between them. Then she spoke again, her voice a little softer this time. "You know," she said, "you remind me of someone." Elon raised an eyebrow, a bit taken aback. "Really?" She smiled, a slight twinkle in her eye. "Yeah. My father used to say something about people who act without thinking, how they always have a special kind of bravery. That's how I think of you." For a moment, Elon couldn't respond. It was an odd comparison, but it struck something deep inside him. He wasn't one for comparisons, especially when it came to things like bravery. He didn't see himself as a hero, he was just a man doing what needed to be done. "Thanks," he finally said. "I think your father must have been a wise man." The woman smiled, a brief, bittersweet smile. "He was." With a final nod, she turned to rejoin the other passengers, leaving Elon standing there, watching her retreating figure. There was a sense of quiet resolve in the way she moved, a calmness that contrasted with the chaos of just moments before. He wondered if she knew something he didn't. The sound of the train's engine whirring to life brought him back to the present. It was time to move on, to let go of the lingering thoughts and get back to work. But for a brief moment, as the train started to move again, Elon felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had stopped the runaway train. And in that instant, he realized something else, that there was always more to be done. This victory, while monumental, was just one step in the grand scheme of things. As the train began to pull away, Elon stepped back into the control room, ready for whatever came next. His team was waiting for further instructions, but for now, all he could do was reflect on the choices that had led to this moment. Choices that, once again, had saved lives. He could hear the voices of the passengers, no longer panicked, but filled with murmurs of gratitude and relief. But for him, there was no time for celebration. Only the next challenge. As Elon took his seat in the control room, the quiet hum of the train's continued movement reverberated through the air. He felt a sense of satisfaction, but there was a small, persistent voice in his mind reminding him that the day wasn't over yet. There were still many details to iron out, many systems to check, and many questions to answer. His mind raced through the steps ahead, how the incident would be reported, the follow-up investigation, and the reassurance of the passengers. He glanced at the team, each of them deeply immersed in their own tasks. The room was filled with a low murmur of activity, but it felt strangely quiet compared to the chaos that had just transpired. He couldn't help but think of the lives that had been affected by the close call. The woman he had spoken to earlier still lingered in his thoughts. Her calm demeanor had stood in stark contrast to the terror around them. It was strange how one person could possess such composure when everything else seemed to fall apart. "You okay?" Tom, the lead engineer, asked as he approached Elon. Tom's voice was calm, but there was a hint of fatigue in his tone. Elon nodded, trying to shake off the lingering sense of urgency. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just processing everything." Tom nodded in understanding. "I get it. It was a close one, but we did what we had to do." "You did what had to be done." The words echoed in Elon's mind. He had always believed in the power of action, but in moments like these, it wasn't just about what had been done, it was about what still had to be done. There were always more steps, always more challenges. "I know," Elon replied, "but it's not over yet. We need to make sure we have the entire system checked. We don't know if there's any lasting damage." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Of course, we'll take care of that. But the fact is, you saved lives today, Elon. That's what matters. That's what counts." Elon appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was always something more. Something he hadn't anticipated. Something that could have gone wrong. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Elon said, pushing the thought aside. "There's still work to be done." As the minutes ticked by, the train continued its journey, the wheels clicking steadily along the tracks. Elon couldn't help but notice the quiet hum of the equipment in the control room, the constant monitoring of systems, the meticulous checking of safety protocols, the quiet determination that had carried them all through this crisis. It was a familiar rhythm for him, one that he had come to rely on in his years of working in high-pressure situations. "Everything seems to be running smoothly," Tom reported, his voice steady. "The tracks are clear, and the train is functioning as expected. We'll need to inspect the engine once we reach the next station, but for now, we're in the clear." Elon let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The immediate crisis was over, but the weight of the responsibility still sat heavily on his shoulders. There was always another layer to the story, another element to consider. "Good," Elon said, running a hand through his hair. "Let's keep monitoring everything closely. No room for mistakes." Tom nodded. "Understood." The rest of the team continued their work, and Elon's thoughts returned to the passengers. He couldn't help but wonder what their experience had been like. Had they realized how close they had come to disaster? Or would they simply see the event as just another close call, one of those things that happens every once in a while? He couldn't know for sure. But what he did know was that they had made it through. The woman he had spoken to earlier was still fresh in his mind. Her calmness in the face of chaos had been remarkable. He'd seen so many people break under pressure, panic setting in, fear overwhelming them, but she had remained composed. There was something in her eyes, something in the way she looked at him that made him wonder if she had been through other trials in her life. Something told him she understood the weight of a moment like this, even if she hadn't fully grasped the scale of it. Elon turned his attention back to the train systems. His mind was racing again, analyzing everything, calculating potential risks, future moves, and strategies. There was a part of him that couldn't stop. Even now, in the afterglow of a victory, he was thinking ahead. The job was never really over. There was always something to improve, always something to perfect. Minutes passed, and Elon allowed himself to feel a small measure of relief. The passengers were safe. The systems were functioning as they should. But even in the midst of this success, his mind kept wandering back to the people. People like the woman he had spoken to, and the passengers on the train who would soon be able to resume their journey. He found himself standing at the large control window again, gazing out over the landscape. The train was cutting through the wilderness, the mountains stretching out in all directions. It was beautiful in its own way, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Life, after all, was fragile. In the blink of an eye, it could be taken away. That was why he did what he did. That was why he pushed himself and his team beyond their limits. But there was more to it than just the thrill of the challenge or the satisfaction of solving a complex problem. It was about the people, the passengers, the lives that could have been lost if they hadn't acted. It was about that moment when everything seemed to hang in the balance, and the weight of the world felt like it rested squarely on his shoulders. And in that moment, as the train continued its journey forward, Elon knew that no matter what came next, he would always be driven by that same relentless pursuit to protect those lives. To be the one who acted, who made the difference when it mattered the most. With that thought, he turned back toward his team. The job wasn't done yet, but it was as close to over as it could get for now. There was always more to do, but for now, they had succeeded. And that was enough. Elon continued to pace back and forth in the control room. Even with the train safely on track and the crisis seemingly averted, his mind kept racing. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that they were always one step away from disaster. Every decision, every move, seemed to matter so much. He had saved them once, but what about the next time? What if there was a flaw in the system they hadn't detected yet? What if there was another disaster lurking just beyond the horizon? Despite the success, Elon knew this feeling of unease would follow him until the very end. It was part of his nature, part of the relentless drive that had brought him this far. It was what made him who he was. The need to stay ahead of the game, to constantly be prepared for whatever challenge would come next. As he stood in the control room, his thoughts drifted back to the woman he had spoken to earlier. Her calmness, her assurance in the face of everything that had gone wrong, had left an impression on him. Not many people could have maintained that level of composure, but she had done it. And in doing so, she had forced him to question his own assumptions about people. How many times had he dismissed someone based on their outward appearance, their mannerisms, or the way they acted? How many opportunities had he missed because he hadn't taken the time to understand the people around him? It wasn't just about saving the train anymore. It wasn't just about the technicalities of the systems, the calculations, the data. It was about the human element. The passengers. The lives they touched. The ones who were affected, directly and indirectly, by every choice he made. He glanced over at Tom, the lead engineer, who was still working tirelessly at his station. Tom had been with him through thick and thin, always keeping a calm head even when things seemed to be falling apart. Elon respected him more than he could express. It was people like Tom who made the difference in moments like these. People who knew how to stay calm when everything else was chaos. "How are we looking?" Elon asked, his voice low. Tom didn't look up from his screen but answered immediately, "Everything's running fine. The systems are stable, no more glitches. The backup power is working, and the brakes are functioning as expected." Elon nodded, a small sigh of relief escaping him. At least there was one less thing to worry about. But the relief was fleeting. He knew that things like this never stayed calm for long. In the back of his mind, he was already preparing for the next emergency. For the next challenge. "I want to make sure that we don't let our guard down," Elon said. "This is just one step. We need to ensure there are no long-term effects, no unseen damage. If there's anything out of the ordinary, I want to know about it immediately." Tom finally looked up, his face filled with understanding. "You got it, Elon. We'll keep an eye on everything." Elon gave a small nod and turned back to the window, looking out at the landscape once more. The mountains loomed large in the distance, their peaks capped with snow. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a moment, Elon felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. But only for a moment. His thoughts once again turned to the passengers. What would their journey be like after all of this? Would they even realize how close they had come to disaster? Would they remember the fear, the chaos, or would it just be another story to tell? One thing was certain, this event would change him. It had already made him rethink the way he approached not only his work but also the people around him. He had always believed that he was doing everything for the greater good. For the future. For the dream of a better world. But what if the key to making that future a reality wasn't in the technology, the systems, or the science? What if it was in something deeper? Something more fundamental? It was a question he didn't have the answer to. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure, the work wasn't over. Not by a long shot. His reverie was interrupted by the sudden sound of a phone ringing. Tom reached for it and pressed the button. "Tom here." There was a brief silence as Tom listened intently, his expression serious. "Understood," he said before hanging up. "Elon, we've just received a report from the maintenance crew. They found something during their routine inspection of the engine. Elon felt his heart skip a beat. "What's going on?" "It's minor, but it could have caused a problem down the line," Tom replied. "It looks like one of the cooling fans is starting to show signs of wear. It's still operational, but if it were to fail, it could lead to overheating." Elon's mind raced as he processed the information. A failure of the cooling system could lead to catastrophic consequences. "Where is it?" he asked urgently. "It's in the engine compartment, toward the rear of the train," Tom said. "We're in the process of isolating the affected area now." Elon didn't hesitate. "Take care of it immediately. I want the engine completely checked. I don't care if we have to stop the whole train. I want everything checked and rechecked. No compromises." Tom nodded, his face serious. "Understood, Elon." As Tom moved off to handle the situation, Elon couldn't help but feel a mixture of frustration and relief. The danger wasn't over. It had only been a brief respite. In this line of work, there was always something new to contend with, always something waiting just around the corner. He could hear the soft hum of the equipment, the buzz of the air conditioning, the click of the train's wheels on the track. The quiet moments were often the most dangerous. They lulled you into a sense of complacency, made you believe that everything was under control. But Elon knew better than that. Nothing was ever truly under control. It was a constant battle, a delicate dance between chaos and order. And the moment you stopped paying attention, that was when things fell apart. The train continued its journey, slicing through the landscape, cutting through the mountains as though nothing had happened. But Elon knew better. There was always something lurking beneath the surface. Something that could throw everything off course at any moment. And as the minutes ticked by, Elon's mind remained focused, vigilant. There was work to do, lives to protect, and a future to secure. He wasn't about to let it slip away. The minutes felt like hours as Elon sat in the control room, watching the train's data stream across the monitors. Every time he looked up, his gaze would flick to the vast expanse of land outside, the same land that had given him so much drive and inspiration in the past. But now, it was different. Every twist and turn of the tracks felt like it carried a heavier weight. The job wasn't just about innovation or efficiency anymore. It was about lives, about ensuring that no matter how far they had come or how much they had achieved, they would never stop being vigilant. He stood up, stretching his arms as a knot in his back tightened from the tension. His eyes moved to the clock. It had been over an hour since the initial incident. Over an hour of watching, listening, and making sure that everything stayed on track. Literally. Tom was still busy with the maintenance issue in the engine compartment, and Elon had received several updates confirming that everything was in hand. But Elon wasn't convinced yet. There was always a part of him that wanted more. More assurance. More proof that they had fixed the problem entirely. What if the issue was deeper than anyone anticipated? What if the next disaster waited in the shadows, waiting to pounce? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He knew that getting worked up wouldn't help anyone, least of all himself. He had to trust the people around him. He had to trust Tom. And trust, in his world, was a rare commodity. But it was something he knew he had to give, even if it felt risky. Elon walked over to the control desk and sat down. As he slid into the chair, he clicked through various systems, double-checking everything. The monitors lit up in front of him, showing the critical systems and data in a maze of numbers and graphs. Everything looked good on the surface. Everything looked stable. But even with all the advanced technology and checks in place, Elon knew that it wasn't about the machines. It was about the people, his team, the passengers, the people who depended on this train being safe. The train was more than just a piece of technology to him. It was a statement. It was his statement that they could solve problems. That they could take on the impossible and turn it into something greater. But with that came a heavy responsibility. Because when you take on the impossible, you also open yourself up to failure. He ran his hands over the desk, his thoughts racing once again. Would he be able to handle the weight of this responsibility? Could he keep everyone safe? Could he continue to push forward with the same level of determination and commitment that had always defined him? The train jolted slightly, and Elon was immediately pulled out of his thoughts. His eyes darted to the screen as he noticed a spike in the pressure gauges. The cooling system wasn't just dealing with the maintenance issue, it was under more stress than it had been before. His heart skipped a beat. "Tom, what's going on?" Elon's voice was sharp, his focus razor-like. Tom's voice came through the intercom, slightly panicked. "Elon, we're seeing a pressure buildup in the cooling system. We're trying to isolate it, but there's too much heat. The system's failing faster than we anticipated." Elon's mind went into overdrive as the new threat hit him like a cold wave. The cooling system had already been the cause of their earlier scare, and now it was threatening to bring everything to a halt. The last thing he needed right now was a failure in the middle of nowhere. If the train systems failed, it would be impossible to get back on track. "We need to shut down the affected section and redirect power to the backup systems," Elon instructed quickly, his voice calm but urgent. He wasn't panicking. He couldn't afford to. "I'm on it," Tom replied, his voice determined. Elon glanced at the monitors, watching as the data adjusted in real time. The pressure was rising, but he knew they had a small window to contain it. It wasn't much, but it was something. He quickly tapped into the emergency protocols, isolating the heat-generating systems and diverting power to the backups. Sweat began to form on his forehead as the seconds ticked by, each one bringing them closer to a full shutdown. The cooling system was still failing, and even with the backup power being redirected, it wasn't enough to guarantee the safety of the entire train. Elon felt his chest tighten. His gaze shifted back to the mountain range outside. The peaceful landscape contrasted so sharply with the chaos that was unfolding just a few meters away. He almost had to laugh at the irony. Everything in life seemed like a balancing act. Calm and chaos, life and death, risk and reward. They were all connected, and no matter how much you tried to control the outcome, sometimes things just didn't go as planned. "How's it looking, Tom?" Elon asked, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. "We're stabilizing the pressure, but the heat's not completely under control." "We need a few more minutes," Tom said, his words clipped, focused. Elon nodded, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. He had trained himself to stay calm in high-pressure situations, to make quick decisions based on data and facts. But this felt different. The weight of what was at stake, lives, technology, everything they had worked for, was heavier than anything he had ever faced before. "Get me everything you need to fix this," Elon said through clenched teeth. "We can't afford to let this train stop. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." There was a pause on the other end before Tom spoke again. "Understood. I'm sending the team to reroute the cooling system. We'll have full control in a matter of minutes." "Good," Elon said, letting out a deep breath. "Keep me updated, and make sure no one takes any chances. This has to be handled right." He glanced out at the passengers through the windows, his thoughts once again shifting. They had no idea what was happening. They were unaware of the perilous situation they were in, but that was a good thing. They didn't need to be worried. He had always believed that part of leadership was shielding others from the chaos, taking the heat so that they didn't have to. But even as the minutes ticked by, Elon knew that they weren't out of the woods yet. There were still too many unknowns, too many variables in play. They had solved the first crisis, but what about the next one? The train continued its journey through the mountains, seemingly undeterred, as though the earth itself was willing it forward. And as Elon watched it move, he knew that this was only the beginning. Elon Musk's determination intensified as the train barreled toward him. His mind was focused, each calculation racing through his head as the sound of the approaching train grew louder. The rustling of the wind and the crunch of gravel beneath his boots were the only things he could hear now. The pressure to stop the train was immense, but Elon had never been one to back down from a challenge, no matter how dangerous. His eyes darted back to the engineer, the person who had been locked in the cabin and was unaware of the impending danger. Without hesitation, Elon sprinted toward the train's control room, his legs burning with every step. The steel tracks seemed to stretch endlessly, but he kept his focus, aware that each second mattered. The train roared louder, its massive wheels grinding over the tracks, and Elon could feel the ground trembling beneath him. He could hear the train's whistle now, a deafening sound that seemed to echo through the mountains as if nature itself was warning him. He pushed harder, his heart racing in time with his footsteps, determined to reach the train before it was too late. As he neared the engine, he saw the massive form of the train growing ever closer. The train was a behemoth, a monster of steel and power, yet Elon felt a strange sense of calm. It was a moment of clarity, the kind of focus that only those who had spent their lives pushing the boundaries of science and technology could understand. This was his moment. He reached the side of the train, gripping the metal rail with one hand and using the other to climb up onto the platform. The train was still moving at breakneck speed, but Elon's focus remained unshaken. He knew that the key to stopping it lay within the control room, and with determination in his eyes, he shoved open the door. Inside, the engineer was frantic, desperately trying to regain control of the runaway train. Sweat poured down his face, his hands shaking as he twisted the controls, but nothing seemed to work. The train was careening toward the edge of a steep cliff, and time was running out. The engineer turned to see Elon standing there, his face set with an expression of resolve. "You have to stop it," the engineer shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I know," Elon said calmly. "I'm going to take over." With swift, practiced movements, Elon grabbed the controls, his hands moving with precision as he assessed the situation. The weight of the train was immense, and the speed it was traveling at made every action critical. He could feel the train pulling away from him, the momentum too strong to be easily overcome, but Elon didn't falter. He had faced far greater challenges before. The pressure was unbearable, but in that moment Elon Musk was a machine, his mind operating at peak efficiency. His eyes locked onto the dials, reading the data in a flash. He could feel the vibrations of the train as the massive wheels thudded against the tracks, the sound reverberating through his bones. Every millisecond counted, but Elon was calm, cool, and calculating. His fingers danced over the controls, making adjustments, analyzing every minute detail as he worked to regain control. The train seemed to resist at every turn, its weight and speed pushing back against his every command. But Elon refused to yield. Outside, the world was blurring as the train neared its breaking point. The sheer force of the engine pushing forward seemed unstoppable, and the distant rumble of the approaching cliff could be heard in the back of his mind. Elon knew that if he failed now, there would be no chance of redemption. Lives were at stake, and failure was not an option. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the control lever began to respond. The train started to slow, its powerful engine finally coming under his control. Slowly, inch by inch, the train's pace decreased, and the looming danger of the cliff became a distant memory. Elon Musk let out a long breath, his hands still gripping the controls as the train came to a stop. The engineer, still shaking, looked at him with wide eyes. "You did it? You really did it?" Elon nodded silently, his mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. The train was stopped, and everyone was safe, but there was no time to celebrate. There would be other challenges ahead, other problems to solve. But for now, Elon knew that he had done what no one else could. As he stepped out of the train's control room, he took a moment to look around. The train, once a monstrous threat, was now at rest. The mountain scenery stretched out before him, a reminder of just how fragile life could be. And yet, he knew that as long as he kept pushing, as long as he kept fighting against the odds, there would always be a way forward. He turned back toward the engineer, who was still standing there, staring at him in disbelief. "Thank you," the engineer said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved all of us." Elon simply nodded. "It's my job." The weight of the moment seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, Elon allowed himself a rare smile. But even as the adrenaline began to subside, he knew there was no time for rest. The world was full of problems, and he would be the one to solve them, just as he always had. With a final glance at the engineer, Elon began walking back toward the front of the train, ready for whatever came next. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: as long as he was around, nothing would be impossible. The world may have been full of challenges, but Elon Musk was always ready to face them head-on. And so, the story of that fateful day lived on, a testament to the courage and determination of a man who never backed down from a challenge. The train had been stopped, and with it, the fears of those who thought the impossible was out of reach. But for Elon Musk, the impossible was merely another problem to solve. As Elon Musk walked through the train cars, he could feel the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. The crisis had been averted, but that feeling of accomplishment was fleeting. It was in these rare moments of calm that Elon found clarity. No matter what challenge came next, he would face it head-on with unyielding determination. The engineer, now visibly relieved, approached Elon and offered a handshake. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today," he said, his voice still shaky from the intense experience. Elon glanced at the man, his expression unreadable for a moment before he smiled. "It's what I do. When there's a problem, I solve it. And in this case, we made it through together." As the engineer and Elon exchanged words of gratitude, the reality of the situation hit them both. They had not only prevented disaster but also stopped a chain of events that could have had catastrophic consequences. The danger was no longer looming, and Elon's mind shifted to what had been learned in the process. There would be new technology, new methods, and new ideas to explore to ensure something like this would never happen again. The town below the mountain pass was a small, peaceful community, and yet it was about to be forever changed by the events of that day. People would tell stories of the man who had single-handedly stopped a runaway train, risking his own life to save hundreds of others. For the residents, it was nothing short of a miracle. But for Elon, it was just another day at the office. The local authorities arrived soon after, along with emergency responders who quickly took over the scene. They were impressed by Elon's swift actions and his clear-headed approach to the situation. But there was no need for public recognition. Elon was already thinking about the next problem to tackle. As always, his focus was on what lay ahead. As he boarded the helicopter that would take him back to his next destination, he gazed out of the window at the town below, now a symbol of survival. The train was stopped, the danger neutralized, and the crisis averted. But Elon knew that life would continue, and there would always be challenges to face, whether on this scale or something much greater. He had built companies that pushed the boundaries of technology, that dreamed of changing the world. But it wasn't the accolades or the achievements that kept him going. It was the problems, those massive, impossible tasks, that he thrived on. They were his fuel, his reason to keep striving for innovation and progress. The helicopter began to ascend, taking him higher into the sky, and the town below shrank into the distance. Elon thought back to the years of effort, to the moments when others had told him that what he wanted to achieve was impossible. Time and time again, he had proven them wrong. And he would continue to do so. When he looked back at the path he had taken, from humble beginnings to becoming one of the most influential figures in the world, he could hardly believe how far he had come. But even with all of his success, Elon knew that the hardest challenges were still ahead. As the helicopter flew through the sky, a message came through his earpiece. There was another crisis brewing in the world, one that needed his expertise. Without hesitation, Elon leaned forward, his focus now on what was coming next. The future held infinite possibilities, but Elon Musk was always ready. He had the knowledge, the resources, and the relentless drive to take on whatever came his way. At that moment, as the helicopter carried him further from the scene of his latest heroics, Elon Musk's thoughts were already on the next problem to solve. Whether it was space travel, sustainable energy, or artificial intelligence, he was determined to shape the future with his own hands. And as long as the world needed solutions, Elon would be there, solving problems, one after the other, no matter how impossible they seemed. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape, Elon couldn't help but smile. He had once again proved that when the world needed a hero, he was ready to answer the call. The helicopter continued its flight, and with every passing moment, Elon Musk's legacy grew, one of unyielding ambition, extraordinary innovation, and the relentless pursuit of progress. The world had been saved once again, but for Elon, this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring another challenge, another opportunity to change the world, and he would be ready.